有啊，林林聲講做假啊嘛，咪樓下做咯。佢講嗰單乜嘢啊？
要橫過你哋個頭，我幫你接住實嗰啲。我讀出你哋打我啦，你。
我啱話咩？個高層話嗰件啊，嗰單你諗嘅係？
高檢通，我嚟。
你有冇影兩嘢啊？影相啊？喂，即係豆台有冇影啊？我要啊嘛，因為影兩嘢俾佢啊嘛。住有 case 啊嘛，揾咗個女。
唔係因為唔俾佢哋影得上先，你係攞去邊啊？佢出咗嚟㗎啦。哦，係，其中嘅係。跟住我就搬。
比較逼啊！如果想影相嘅話咧，我哋可以過去隔離間房同阿 Lee 影啲相先，跟住我哋就再翻嚟去做呢個 briefing。Because the room is too packed, so we can move our cameras just for a photo to at the room next door, and then we can come back for the video. Yeah, sorry about that.
擺度。我入晒鏡係咁啊！
Oh, yes.
Go to that side first.
Sure.
Okay. You're ready, and I will just kick off whether you'd like to go.
Okay.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today at ECA International media briefing for ECA's latest salary trend survey. So we are glad to have Lee, the Regional Director for Asia at ECA International here to share more details with every one of you. So over to you, please, Lee.
Thank you very much. So, firstly, thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time today out of your schedules to come and see me, and obviously to hear about the findings of our latest research on salaries and salary trends both in Hong Kong, Greater China and the Asia Pacific region. Before I go into the information itself about the survey and the results, just a little bit of information about us. ECA International is a human resources consultancy. We focus on providing advice and data to companies as they move their staff around the world. And as part of that, we undertake various surveys, which includes a salary trend survey where we survey how much salaries are increasing or decreasing in over 60 countries around the world. Just to give you a bit of background about the survey itself. So the results that I'll be presenting to you today is based on a survey which we undertook earlier this year in 2021. The survey was undertaken between August and September, with the results published and made available to our clients late in October. Companies were asked to report on actual salary increases for 2021 and also forecast salary increases for the following year, so 2022. And in the case of participation, globally we had over 370 companies participate and provide details of what they were proposing to increase their employees' salaries by. In the case of Hong Kong, the data for Hong Kong is based on the input of over 130 companies. Now, those companies are typically either multinational companies or medium to large scale Hong Kong headquartered companies. So small to medium sized enterprises weren't represented in this survey. It was more multinationals and medium to large scale or local companies. In the case of Hong Kong, as mentioned, we had participation from about 130 organisations. Our survey reports themselves cover 70 countries worldwide, including over 20 in the APAC region. We also covered most major industries: financial services, engineering, technology, transportation, logistics, retail, and so on and so forth. And the survey focuses primarily on white-collar staff. So it's looking at salary trends provided to office-based staff from a junior manager all the way up to senior managerial level. So what I'll be doing is I'll be sharing the results of the survey. And essentially, the survey is based on what we refer to as merit-based increases. What a merit-based increase is it's an increase made by the company to their employees, accounting for both anticipated inflation, but also any increase to reflect the employee's performance. Also, it's important to point out that in the press release that you have, as well as the data that I'll be sharing, I'll be talking about what we refer to as nominal salary increases and also real salary increases. So just to explain the difference between the two, a nominal salary increase is basically the rate of increase that the company is going to provide to the employee. So let's say, for example, you have an employee who earns 10,000 Hong Kong dollars per month. Then the company says we will give you an increase of 5%. So therefore that employee's salary increases to 10,500. So that's a nominal increase. However, a real increase then takes the impact of inflation into consideration. So obviously, if a person's salary goes up by 5%, however, goods and services may have also increased during the same time. So if, let's say, for example, the company increases a person's salary by 5%, but inflation, the price of goods and services, increases by 4%, then in real terms, a person's salary only increases by 1%. So taking both the increase in nominal as well as the impact of inflation into consideration. So looking at the results, what I'll start off by doing first is sharing some global information. So first and foremost, looking at the 70 countries that we researched, if we take all of those 70 countries into consideration, on average in 2021, all countries or employees in all of these countries on average would have seen a salary increase of 3.5%. However, there's a significant variation in the range of salary increase amongst these 70 countries. The location which saw the highest rate of increase was Argentina in South America, where salaries went up by 15% in 2021. And the location which saw the lowest rate of increase was Switzerland in Europe, where salaries in 2021 only increased by 1.9% in comparison to 2020. For those of you who were here last year when we did a similar briefing, we noted last year that many countries also implemented salary freezes in immediate response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The good news is in 2021, no countries indicated that there was a salary freeze for the majority of their employees. So what we're seeing is there has been a general return to salary growth globally in 2021 in comparison to 2020. If we look regionally, while globally the average rate of increase was 3.5%, what we saw was significant variation. So Europe saw the lowest average rate of increase at 2.4%. Then we saw both Asia Pacific, which is obviously where Hong Kong is located, and Americas, both North America and South America. The average rate of increase throughout that region was 4%. And the location with the highest rate of nominal increase was Africa and the Middle East, where workers throughout these locations are expected to see a 4.5% increase in their salaries in 2021. If we move on to the region, something to explain here is firstly, following on what I mentioned in the previous slide in terms of a global recovery, we're also seeing that in the region. So most locations in the region in 2021 recorded higher rates of salary increase in comparison to 2020. There are only a small number of locations where the rate of increase in 2021 is lower than 2020. So an example was Myanmar, where because of recent social political tensions there, obviously the economy is not performing very well. So the rates of salary increase in 2021 are lower than what were actually provided in 2020. Also indicative of the relatively good news is the fact that, as I mentioned before, whereas generally speaking a large proportion of companies reported that they were going to be freezing salaries in 2020, in 2021 that's reduced significantly. So in 2020, 40% of our participants in the region indicated that they were freezing salaries for their employees. However, in 2021 that's reduced significantly. It's gone down to only 14%, and we expect that trend to continue into 2022 with fewer companies freezing salaries in 2022 and beyond as well. We also see that we're expecting a continuation in this optimism. So salaries, as I've mentioned, in 2021 have increased at a faster rate in comparison to 2020, which is good news. So in the region as a whole, salaries have increased in 2021 by an average of 4%. We're expecting that trend to quicken in 2022, with salaries increasing on average in the region by 5%. However, there is obviously a degree of variation throughout the region. Obviously, we're looking at 20 countries in the region here, from Japan all the way down to Australia and New Zealand. Some of these are high-income, relatively developed locations such as Australia, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, where salary rates of increase will be relatively low. So they're expected to be below that 4% in 2021 and below that 5% in 2022. Because there are many developing economies with high rates of inflation where average rates of salary increase will be much higher. So we're seeing places such as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, etc., relatively developing locations with high rates of inflation. Therefore, salaries are expected to increase at a much faster rate in these locations, by somewhere between 8, 9 or 10% in both 2021 and 2022. So if we look, for example, in terms of the ranking of those 20 locations that we're looking at in APAC, which locations in the region are workers expected to see the highest rate of increase in 2021, so this year? So what we can see is, as I mentioned, those developing economies with relatively high rates of inflation are expected to see the highest rate of increase. Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, where we're expected to see salaries increase by 8% or more this year. Then through to places like Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Cambodia and China, where salaries will probably increase by somewhere between 5 to 7%. Through to places such as Laos, Philippines, Malaysia, where they'll probably be around 4.5 to 5% in 2021. However, as I've mentioned, nominal salary increases just give you one side of the story. A person's salary, even if they get a 8% increase in salary, that doesn't necessarily translate to an 8% increase in the person's purchasing power, because goods and services may also increase in price, as well as other factors may also erode that person's spending power. So once we take inflation into consideration and we look at real salaries, then the picture changes somewhat. So the location where workers in 2021 should see the highest improvement or the greatest improvement in their purchasing power are actually in mainland China, because although in nominal terms salaries are forecast to rise at only the 7th fastest in the region in nominal terms in 2021, because of relatively lower rates of inflation in China in comparison to places like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh and so on, workers' take-home pay or their purchasing power will increase at the fastest rate in the region in 2021. And then as you can see below that, we've got places such as Vietnam, Thailand, our neighbour Macau having the 4th highest rate of salary increase in 2021, all the way down, and we can also see elsewhere in the Greater China region, Taiwan in 10th place. So Taiwan, workers in Taiwan, their salaries will increase at the 10th fastest rate in real terms this year. You'll see Hong Kong is obviously absent from here. So let's have a look if we can focus on data for Hong Kong. And what I'd like to do here is just show some historical perspective first and foremost. So what this red line here shows you is typically the rate of salary growth over the course of the last just over 10 years, since before the global financial crisis. So what we saw back in 2008, on the eve of the global financial crisis, workers in Hong Kong would have expected to receive an increase in their salaries of 4.5%. Then obviously the recession comes along, the rate of salary increase drops significantly to 1%, but then we see a recovery, up to 3% the following year, then up to 4.5%, and then we see a continuation of that 4.5% for a period of time. Then the rate of growth then slows down to 4% up until 2019. And then obviously in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as social political tensions here in Hong Kong, the rate of salary growth then drops down to 2.1% last year. It then recovers to 2.5% in 2021, and we're expected to see a continuation of that recovery next year, where based on our survey results, employers are expecting to give their employees, on average, a salary increase of 3.2% in 2022. So that indicates some relatively good news, because it indicates a degree of recovery in the case of salary growth here in Hong Kong. The other thing to bear in mind is the rate of real growth in salaries. So once we strip out inflation, the yellow line here shows how much workers' purchasing powers have actually increased in these years. So what you can see is, obviously, if that yellow line remains above zero, that's good. That indicates that in real terms, workers' salaries are increasing in comparison to previous year. But what we can also see is, once we take inflation into consideration, the increase in real incomes is actually not growing by so much. Back in 2008, even during that boom time before the global financial crisis, because of relatively high rates of inflation, real incomes were only increasing by about 0.2%. And as we go through the recovery from the global financial crisis, even then, salaries in real terms weren't increasing by much more than 1% to 1.5%. But again, what we can see, again here, in this year and next year, we are expecting to see some improvement in real incomes, from a rate of increase of 0.5% this year, going up to hopefully 1.1% in terms of real growth in the year to come. So that's relatively good news for Hong Kong, because it indicates, first and foremost, we are seeing a recovery. We've seen a rate of increase in the extent of salary growth in 2021 in comparison to 2020, and we're going to expect to see a quickening of that in 2022. And also in real terms, that yellow line remains above zero, so it indicates that in real terms, after inflation is taken into consideration, people should expect to see an improvement in their purchasing power, both this year and next year. So if we look into this in more detail, just to provide a bit more context. So while Hong Kong is out of the top 10, both in terms of nominal rates of salary growth, as well as real rates of salary and growth, that is actually similar to elsewhere in the region in terms of Hong Kong's comparators. So Hong Kong is a relatively high salary, advanced economy in the region. So it's not necessarily going to compare itself against salary growth in places like Pakistan, India, Vietnam and so on, because these are developing high inflation countries. Instead, we should be looking at comparing salary growth rates in Hong Kong with other comparing locations, such as perhaps Singapore, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand and so on and so forth. And in comparison to these peers, salary growth in Hong Kong is in line with these locations, so that's relatively good news. But it's important to also know that recovery in salary growth in Hong Kong will be slow. Firstly, a couple of other points to bear in mind. While we see some recovery in Hong Kong, it's recovering at a slower rate than elsewhere in the Greater China region. So, for example, salaries in mainland China are expected to go from 5% last year up to 5.8% this year. So that's a much faster rate of growth. Likewise, in Macau went from having 0% growth last year to 2.5% growth this year. So that's a much faster rate of growth in Macau as well. And this is likely due to the fact that we're seeing an underlying economic risk associated with the COVID-19 pandemic here in Hong Kong. And it's also important to bear in mind that Hong Kong's relatively low rate of salary growth isn't just unfavourable in comparison to elsewhere in Greater China. We're also seeing rates of salary increase at a faster rate in Singapore as well. So that's also maybe subject for concern. If we look at industry variation, as mentioned, all companies in our survey on average saw an increase in salaries of 2.5% in 2021. But if we look at particular industries, the industry which we saw the lowest rate of growth was the transportation and logistics sector, where on average in 2021 salaries only grew by 1.6%. This compares with the technology sector, which saw the greatest or the fastest rate of growth, where salaries grew by 2.9%. Something to also bear in mind is the fact that these forecasts are obviously subject to the impact of inflation. So when we've looked at the rates of real salary increase, it's based on a forecast for 2022. Now we know that there's a global risk or global threat from inflation, with relatively high rates of inflation being noted in many major economies around the world, such as the USA, for example, Europe, and so on and so forth. So if we see inflation increase at a faster rate than we expect, that will have a significant impact on people's purchasing powers, and that may actually cause that yellow line in 2022 to dip below 0, which indicates that people's salaries will actually reduce in real terms in comparison to this year. So if we look at our forecast for Hong Kong for 2022, one thing to bear in mind here is obviously the forecast is dependent on economic recovery. So the extent to which the economy in Hong Kong can recover from COVID-19 and obviously continue to try and grow. It's also important to bear in mind that when people make their forecasts to us as part of these surveys for the next year, they are often optimistic. So as we saw, for example, this year, we recorded a rate of growth from the participants of 2.5%. However, when we asked those same participants last year to make their forecasts, they were expecting to increase salaries by 3.2% this year. So they were much more optimistic last year in terms of what they thought they may be able to pay their employees in comparison to what they could deliver. So although companies are expecting to be able to increase salaries by 3.2% again in 2022, that may not be possible because of the underlying risks associated with the economy. The recovery will also be gradual. So for example, as I mentioned, prior to the global financial crisis, rates of salary increase in Hong Kong were 4.5%. And then they dropped, but it then took 4 years for them to recover to their pre-recession levels. And then after that, they stayed at 4.5% for a little while. So once again, we saw, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw once again a fall in the rate of salary growth last year. But it's unlikely that we'll see a return to 4%, which is what we had prior to the pandemic, for maybe 2, 3 or 4 years. And even then, that will be dependent on what happens with the Hong Kong economy between now and then. So that speed of the recovery, both the extent to which we can probably return back to 4% in terms of our annual salary growth, and also if we will be able to return to 4%, is dependent on many factors. It's dependent on things such as how quickly can we reopen, or how comprehensively can we reopen the Hong Kong economy. So obviously there are certain restrictions that are still in effect on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. Social distancing restrictions, for example, restrictions on people being able to enter and exit Hong Kong, which all have an impact on Hong Kong's economic activity. So the degree to which we'll see an economic recovery obviously is impacted by the speed of the vaccine rollout here, and obviously the requirement perhaps of people requiring booster shots for the COVID-19 pandemic and the ability of the government to roll those out. It also depends on the ability that Hong Kong has in terms of reopening borders. Leading up to 2019 and 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously Hong Kong's borders were very much open. Our economy thrived somewhat on a large amount of travel in and out of Hong Kong, both in terms of business travel as well as tourism. So that has dried up in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the extent to which our economy will recover will probably be dependent on the extent to which travel resumes. But also that's dependent very much on external factors. So, for example, one of the factors which prevents Hong Kong's borders from reopening is obviously our desire to comply with mainland China's requirements in terms of quarantine and obviously social distancing and COVID-19 measures. So obviously we're dependent on how confident authorities in mainland China are of Hong Kong's ability to deal with any pandemic, and therefore their willingness to allow quarantine-free travel between the mainland and Hong Kong and vice versa. If we then look elsewhere, outside of Hong Kong itself, and looking at Greater China, so as I've indicated, it obviously comes as no surprise, I'm sure, to everybody here that salaries will grow at the fastest rate in mainland China out of all locations in the Greater China region. And we expect 5% rate of increase this year and 5.8% rate of increase next year. In Macau, we're seeing, once again, a return to salary growth, and we're seeing salary growth in Macau of 2.5% this year, similar to what we've seen also here in Hong Kong. So that rate of increase is similar to Hong Kong, but also the good news is that for most people in Macau, where they didn't actually see an increase in salaries in 2020, this is obviously indicating a return to some form of salary growth. What we're also seeing, however, is we're seeing since 2020, Taiwan has actually started to overtake Hong Kong in terms of the extent or the speed with which salaries grow. So leading up to 2020, Hong Kong was typically above Taiwan in terms of the rate of salary growth. However, since 2020, this year and also forecast for next year, salaries will grow at a faster rate in Taiwan in comparison to Hong Kong. Now that's because, in part, the economy seems to be a little bit more open to international trade in Taiwan in comparison to Hong Kong. And also the economy seemed to have performed, or the country, or the location rather, seemed to have coped quite well in terms of its response to the COVID-19 pandemic at the outset. So we're expecting to see some outperformance of Taiwan in comparison to Hong Kong, both this year and next year. So in terms of our summary, in terms of our results, generally good news is in the Asia Pacific region, salary increases remain above trend in comparison to elsewhere in the world. And even though in Hong Kong salaries are, the rate of growth is low in comparison to elsewhere in the region, so our rate of growth in Hong Kong was 2.5% in comparison to 4% for the wider region. If you compare Hong Kong with its regional and global peers, Hong Kong's actually pretty similar. So 2.5% is above most of developed Europe. 2.5% is similar to places such as Canada. 2.5% is also similar to locations such as Korea, Japan, Australia and New Zealand. So that's relatively good news. So while we could argue that rates of growth are low relative to the region as a whole and the Greater China region, they are in line with their peer group, although they are lower at the moment in comparison to both Macau and Taiwan and Singapore. The forecast for 2022 is that rate of recovery is still likely to be relatively slow. we will not see a return to 4% rates of growth in Hong Kong next year. As we've seen, at most optimistic level, we're expecting to see an increase to 3.2%. And as I've said before, forecasts are often more optimistic than reality. So if we get to 3%, we'll be very happy. It may be about 2 or more years before we get to 4% once again. But that recovery is dependent on factors such as, obviously, external factors beyond our control. What happens with the COVID-19 pandemic? Are there any further variants? Does Hong Kong become affected by the Delta variant, for example? And if so, what impact does that have on the economy? As well as, obviously, factors here such as the extent to which Hong Kong reopens its borders, allows people to come and travel once again for both business travel and tourism to help kickstart or reinvigorate the Hong Kong economy. So some of these factors which will influence the degree to which Hong Kong will recover are obviously factors that are dependent on the performance of the Hong Kong economy. Some of them are actually due to factors which are beyond Hong Kong's control, such as what happens with regards to COVID-19 globally. As mentioned, is there another variant, and what impact does that have on the global economy? So on that note, that's the end of the briefing itself in terms of the summary of our data. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask in relation to anything that I've just presented?
What is the ranking of Hong Kong in next year in the Asia?
What is the ranking of Hong Kong next year? I don't have that to hand, but I can get that information for you.
It's only top 10. But
yes.
This is the last one. Taiwan is 2, but Hong Kong is only 1.1. So I would like to know what is the in the middle. How many rankings? And I would like to know. Can I briefly tell us that why Hong Kong the real wages is so low than other different other countries? So the real wages are relatively low, but that's not too dissimilar to other major developed economies. Is this mainly due to the inflation?
Of course. Well, it's due to 2 factors. It's due to, obviously, number one, the nominal rate of salary increase. So as I've indicated, this year the nominal rate of salary increase is 2.5%. So that's already lower than previous years. And then we've also got inflation. So if inflation is obviously 1%, then 1% from 2.5% leaves a real rate of increase of 1.5%. If, on the other hand, you're looking at a country where you've got a salary rate, an increase of 5%, such as mainland China, and you have inflation of a similar rate of 1%, then obviously in that case, 1% from 5% leaves a real rate of increase of 4%. So one of the reasons why the real rate of salary increase in Hong Kong is low is because the nominal rate is low. But the other reason will be due to inflation as well. So rates of inflation in Hong Kong are about 1 to 1.5%, whereas if your nominal rate of increase is about 2.5%, that doesn't leave much scope for an increase in real wages. But one thing to bear in mind is, as I've mentioned, that nominal rate of increase for Hong Kong is not too dissimilar to peer locations, so comparable locations. So it's not too dissimilar to locations such as Australia, it's not too dissimilar to locations such as Singapore, such as Japan, Western Europe and North America. So while it may be low relative to other locations in the region, those other locations in the region, as I've mentioned, are relatively high inflation or high salary increase locations, whereas Hong Kong is not one of those. It's not a developing location, so salaries will grow at a much slower rate in comparison to developing economies.
So the main effect is that the people will go to other countries to work, or the other many talents will go to China or somewhere, and Hong Kong will. Well,
not necessarily, because even though salaries may grow at a slower rate here, salaries are still higher. So, for example, I could go to Pakistan, for example, and then my salary could increase by 8% per year. But if in Pakistan I earn 1/4 of what I earn here, If I increase that by 8% each year, it's still going to take about 20 years for me to catch up with the salary which I used to earn in Hong Kong. So that doesn't necessarily so a low rate of salary growth does not necessarily mean that people in Hong Kong are worse off in comparison to their global peers. Any other questions?
So,
yes.
So more and more people is expected to immigrate to other places, and will it expected next few years in order to save the labor force and the salary base will be more higher than the current level, like beyond 2023.
So we do expect a recovery in the rate of salary growth, as I've indicated. So we're expecting to see 3.2% next year. That's in 2022. And obviously we expect a recovery again in 2023. So we may well see salaries grow to about 3.5% rate of increase in 2023, looking at previous trends. However, the extent to which salaries can continue to grow in Hong Kong are dependent on factors. They're dependent on factors such as company revenue. So a company can only pay its workers what it can afford. So if the economy is not doing so well, even if workers deserve or want a salary increase, if their profits aren't high enough, they can't necessarily afford to give them that. So while we are expecting to see growth or continuing recovery, it will be dependent on the economy and how well the economy recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic. And as mentioned, some of that is due to factors beyond Hong Kong's control. So we've already seen the global economy start to recover from last year's pandemic. However, that recovery is very fragile. We've already seen that many locations worldwide are obviously starting to see an increase once again in COVID-19 rates. We've seen some countries in Europe start to go back into lockdown, which will also have an impact on global GDP. So if that has an impact on the Hong Kong economy, then obviously that will have an impact on the extent to which companies in Hong Kong's revenues can grow, and that will also have an extent to which how much they can afford to increase their employees' salaries next year and the year beyond. Any other questions? Yes.
From the results, it is showed that industry variation, that the transport and logistics just 1.6%.
Yes.
But the research focus on the office worker. Does it mean that the office worker in that industry that they get the salary lower, or it in fact also reflect also other workers in that company?
No, it only reflects white-collar office-based workers. So it won't reflect, for example, blue-collar workers, frontline workers, where their salaries may have increased at a faster rate or may have increased at a slower rate. But obviously we know that the transportation and logistics sector, in terms of the white-collar sector particularly, has been significantly impacted because of obviously the impact of COVID-19 on Hong Kong's economy and obviously people's abilities to exit and enter Hong Kong. Any other questions?
So any other industry will have a low rate in Hong Kong, except transport?
No, that was the one which was below trend. Yes.
Only that's below the average.
Based on our results, obviously, as I said at the start, our survey covered 130 companies, and that 130 companies were largely medium to large scale enterprises, local headquartered and MNCs. So there may have been certain sectors, for example, retail or catering, which saw a lower rate of increase, but they may not have been covered by our survey because these are typically small to medium-sized enterprises who weren't surveyed, or rather who didn't respond to our survey.
Sorry, follow-up question. And as you mean, the growth rate will be recovering in the next few years.
Yes.
But this also means that the economy is facing so many headwinds also.
Exactly. So we expect the economy to recover. We expect salaries to continue to recover if we look at previous trends. However, as you rightly point out, there are many headwinds. We still are not out of the woods when it comes to our recovery from the global COVID-19 pandemic. So the extent to which the world can continue to overcome from that, global vaccine rollout, reopening of borders once again, that will obviously influence the degree to which that recovery will continue and be consistent. Any other questions? Yes.
This is Carl from Now TV. I would like to ask, besides the salary rates, I would like to know more about the unemployment rate, because the government is going to release the latest data. So because we can see the latest number of the market forecast is the decreasing rate is slowing down. So do you see that the decreasing rate will keep it slow down, and how your latest forecast to the unemployment rates and the next year also?
Okay. I'm sorry to inform you that we only covered salary trends.
Okay.
So we didn't actually ask about unemployment rates. But just to let you know that there is generally a correlation between unemployment and salary growth. So generally speaking, as unemployment falls, the rate at which salaries grow should increase. The reason for this is obviously because more companies are hiring workers and chasing after workers. And because unemployment rates, if they fall, then there's a smaller talent pool for companies to be able to draw upon. And therefore, they have to pay more in order to encourage people to either leave their current employer and work for them, or they have to pay more to retain their staff and prevent them from joining another employer. So, in response to your question, while we didn't survey unemployment rates, there is generally a correlation. And so if unemployment rates continue to fall, that should put an upward pressure on salary trends both in 2022 and 2023. You're welcome. Okay. Any more questions? If not, I think we'll wrap up there then. Thank you very much. If you do have any other questions that you'd like to ask one-on-one, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, thank you very much everybody for coming today, and we hope this has been of interest and use to you. Thank you.
May I have the number of the ranking of Hong Kong?
For
the ranking.
The ranking, yes, you can. If you speak to...
Is Hong Kong the lowest?
No.
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 transport 同埋另外一個最高嘅話係資源嗰度，咁有冇其他啲講？
行業方面嘅數據，我可能要再 check 嗰件事，但係因為 ECA 嘅 full report 係一個 project basis， 係啦，咁所以如果有咩好 specific 嘅數據，可以嘗試幫你 check 嘅係。唔好意思啊，佢係零嘅。OK， 好啊。除咗個 ranking 之外，仲有咩問題？慢慢話俾我聽啦。咁我諗今日大概就差唔多啦。咁如果仲有咩問題嘅話咧，咁可以陣間揾翻我啦，或者之後 send 翻 email 俾我哋都可以嘅。唔該晒。
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. For the answer, each came one way. Do you want to do that? Should we do it here or should we do it somewhere else?
I think here they just want to record you and they make it for the next round.
Okay, sure, no problem. All right. Okay.